Greetings. I'm speaking to you in the year 2023 on the secular calendar, and this is the Sabbath prior to the festival of Purim. And last week I spoke about Purim, and I am appreciative of the response, to that message, and I want to thank both of you for your interest. No, I'm kidding. But I'm grateful for the response for that week, and I certainly hope and pray for a positive response this week as I continue on discussing the Purim festival. And as I said last week, those of you who are joining us and celebrating it, Chag Sameach to you, Chag Purim Sameach. And those of you who, for whom it is not a part of necessarily your community, it is not a commanded appointed time of Leviticus 23 where God says these are my appointed times. This is an appointed time the Jewish community has accepted upon itself to observe. So you could describe it as a Jewish holiday and look at it from that perspective. However, I would recommend to anyone that around this time of year you read the Book of Esther. And I want to say more about that in just a moment. In fact, I want to say something about it right now. This talk is about the fifth festival scroll. The fifth festival scroll. The Bible has a five-fold pattern, beginning with the 5 books of Moses, the 5 books of the law, the Torah, the Pentateuch, the Chumash. And in the Bible, 5 is symbolic of God's love. Think of the English word, if you speak English, grace, G-R-A-C-E. And so God's love is shown in multiples of 5. And we have the 5 books of the law, and we have the 5 books of the Psalms, and we have the 5 festival scrolls. I just want to give you one example of how the symbolism of the number 5. In 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 19, Paul says, "Yet in the church I would rather speak 5 words with my understanding, that I may teach others also, than 10,000, which is also multiple of 5, than 10,000 words in a tongue." Now, I could start speaking to you in Swahili by miracle. It's possible. I haven't asked God for that kind of a miracle, nor would he necessarily answer it positively if I did. But I could be speaking to you in Swahili, and but you could say Hakuna Matata, right? No problem. It is a problem because, my audience normally, generally speaking, doesn't understand it. So what good would it do you? You might be impressed by the miracle, but you wouldn't gain much from the message. But anyway, so you see here the symbolism of the number 5. I want to go from there to the book of Mark, the 6th chapter and the 23rd verse. And here we have Herod Antipas, who martyrs John the Baptist. It's a very grisly account here of what happened to John the Baptist, but it starts with the influence of a woman. The woman here uses her influence negatively, I'll say. But on the other hand, Esther, the heroine of the Book of Esther, uses her feminine influence in a very positive way. So we have the contrast here. But notice in verse 23, what Herod says to the daughter of Herodias. He also swore to her, "Whatever you ask me, I will give you, up to half my kingdom." Now, anybody reading that would think, oh yeah, that's what happened with Esther on the positive side. You have 3 times there in the book of Esther where Ahasuerus, or Xerxes the First, I believe he was. Where Xerxes the First says to Esther, up to half the kingdom, and that worked out positively. This worked out, of course, this was a crime. But what I'm saying is that the book of Esther is echoed here in Mark. And also, if you read the Septuagint version of Esther, you'll find that, I believe it is in the introduction there of the way the Septuagint has recorded the book of Esther, you'll see influences on the book of Revelation. And indeed there is quite a link between the book of Esther and the book of Revelation, but that's something that I can maybe cover at another time. As I said, the Book of Esther is the fifth of the festival scrolls. As we go through the ecclesiastical year, we begin in the spring, and that is the time to read Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, Canticles, the Song of Solomon. And it is read publicly in the synagogues in Orthodox communities on the Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread. Then we have Shavuot, the Festival of Weeks, or Pentecost, the festival of the 50th day, and there the Book of Ruth is read, and there are connections between the Book of Ruth and the festival of Pentecost, one of which is that the Jewish tradition that David died at that time, and Ruth, of course, is the great-grandmother of David. And then we go on to midsummer, and we have the fast of the 5th month, and the time of the reading of the Book of Lamentations. That's the third of the festival scrolls. Then as we come to the 7th month on the ecclesiastical calendar, with the month of the autumn festivals, we read the Book of Ecclesiastes during the Festival of Tabernacles, and if it starts on a Sabbath, then we'll read it on the Sabbath during that festival. But if it starts on a Sabbath, it's generally read then on the 8th day of Sacred Assembly. And as we approach those times, I'll have more to say, God willing, about those scrolls. Then we come to the conclusion of the ecclesiastical year, the 12th month, and in some years, if they're intercalary, there's a 13th month. So we come to the month of Adar, and in the month of Adar, we have the festival of Purim on the 14th day of that month, pardon me, and also to some degree on the 15th day. So we have the Book of Esther, the 5th festival scroll, and there's so many lessons we can derive from the Book of Esther. So I want to go back there now, and I want to begin right off by, the way the book begins. And first of all, I want to go to the Book of Ezra. I'll go back to these historical books. In the King James Bible, it would, I guess, here, right, there's, of course, the Hebrew order is different than what we have in most of the English translations that you're using. But if I go to the Book of Ezra and these historical books, if you look between the 6th chapter and the 7th chapter, I'm not going to read anything, but I'll just say, if you go to Ezra 6 and then you go to Ezra 7, in the middle of that's where the Book of Esther comes out. Chronologically, it comes between Ezra 6 and Ezra 7. And so, you find it after the book of Nehemiah in your translations, most of you, unless you're using a Jewish translation. So I want to go to the Book of Esther, and evidently the events in the book culminate in 472 BC with the final victory of the Jews over their opponents, but it was a very desperate situation for a while, as you know if you've read the book. But here we have in Xerxes, and I want to read Esther 1:1. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. He had a great empire, and his wealth is described in this chapter. And he was planning eventually to invade the Greek-speaking world. And that happened between the 1st and 2nd chapter. But perhaps all of these festivities that he was organizing here was to prepare, to get to sort of line up his supporters, his empire, and get them, all in a positive frame of mind to follow him into invading the Greek-speaking world. But we see a prophecy of this empire back in Daniel. And so now Daniel in your Bible would be after Ezekiel. Anyway, I'm going to go to Daniel 11, and here you see a prophecy at the time of the beginning of the Medo-Persian Empire about Ahasuerus. I'm going to go to Daniel 11, and this angel is speaking to Daniel. This is a very long prophetic passage. Begins in effect in the 10th chapter and goes all the way through the end of the book. But in Daniel 11, I want to go to verse 2. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than them all. By his strength, through his riches, you shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. But of course, he failed. And then later on it prophesies about Alexander the Great, if you keep reading Daniel 11. And then we have his empire breaking up, and we have the king of the north, the king of the south, the Seleucids, the Ptolemies. So we have prophecy. So as you read the book of Esther, there's already, in effect, a prophecy being fulfilled here with the greatness of the empire of Xerxes. And prophecy, of course, is one of the indications, of God's involvement with human affairs, of the reality of God, and of his involvement with human affairs, as he says in the 46th chapter of Isaiah. God inspires prophecy and he fulfills prophecy, and in Isaiah 46 and verse 9, he said, "Remember the former things of old." By the way, this is the Sabbath of remembrance in the Jewish community, Shabbat Zachor, where they read about the Amalekites, because Haman perhaps was an Amalekite. Verse 9, "Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure." So God inspires prophecy and fulfills it. And the prophecy in Daniel 11 is fulfilled in the book of Esther. And if we go to the second chapter of Esther, we see here that Ahasuerus had replaced his queen, had gotten rid of his original, the queen that he had in the first chapter, and now he has to replace her. And meantime, he had gone off to Greece and lost out there. Now he's back, and now he's concerned with with having a new queen. So now we're in the year 479 to 478 BC. And so it is interesting how God works out that Esther is the one chosen. God directs events, so that Esther is the one chosen. Now, the book of Esther, as I mentioned last week, shows God implied. It doesn't directly mention God in the book, but you see his working in the book, and you see how Esther hides her identity at first, and then her identity is revealed. So there's a certain secrecy in the book of Esther. And if you go back to the fourth festival scroll, it's the one before this one, and this one begins with the copula and. I'm saying see how the English translates it. It says, "Now it came to pass." So the Hebrew is simply the copula and, so it links it back to the earlier festival scroll. What's the last verse in Ecclesiastes? I'm going to go to the 13th verse. "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all." Zeh kol ha'adam, this is all the human being. "For God," this is verse 14 now, "for God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil." And so that's how the book concludes. And now we have an illustration from that. And it was, at the time of King Xerxes, this plot of Haman, was thwarted by God. And so whether something is public or secret, God ultimately is the judge. And he judged Haman's wickedness and dealt with it. So we see God as judge in the book of Esther, of course. That's another lesson from the book. That the whole story shows that. And it does show God's involvement in human history. In other words, the Bible is a theistic text. It is not necessarily a deistic text. God didn't just turn the universe on and then let it ride. He involves himself because he has a plan. He has a plan of salvation, and it's going to work out successfully. Because God is a winner, and those who are on God's side are winners. So anyway, we in the book of Esther, we find on the second chapter of the 18th verse a foreshadowing already of the holiday that will yet occur. Now the Jews have a tradition that when Haman came to the king, one of his objections was, well, the Jews have all these holidays where they take off time from work and so on, and celebrate. They have their own holidays. They have a lot of their own holidays. And so the verdict was they're going to have another holiday, and you're going to be the cause of it. That's kind of a Jewish tradition. Purim, in the Jewish community is a time for the expression of humor. And if I have time, I'll talk more about that. But I think the tradition, most people think of Jews as people with a sense of humor. A lot of famous comedians have a Jewish background, and some of it has to do with the way Purim was observed, I believe, over the centuries. Anyway, we go to verse 18. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. Kiyad HaMelech. He gave according to the generosity of a king. And it's interesting. That sort of foreshadowed what was yet to come. But now we have the third chapter. We have the problem. And I want to read the 8th verse of chapter 3. This is a very important lesson from the book of Esther. We understand God prophesies and fulfills the prophecy. We understand that God directs history. I want to show a couple of verses on how God directs history. One is in Deuteronomy 32 and around verse 8, which show that God is the master geopolitician. Deuteronomy 32. And I wanted to go all the way back to the 7th verse. Remember the days of old. As I said, this Sabbath is called the Sabbath of Remembrance in the Jewish community. Remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you, your elders, and they will tell you. And see, the Bible does have a lot of history. It's for a reason. We need to know that background. When the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the children of Israel. So God directed human history for the purposes of setting up what should have been a model nation in the center of the earth, the Mediterranean region, the center of the earth. And he directed history so that Israel could have had the opportunity to really be a positive influence. Unfortunately, they, to use a metaphor, fumbled the ball, but they will yet fulfill their role. But now I want to go to the book of Acts, where similar thought is given to the brilliant scholars of Athens. We have the Greek-speaking community to thank for the New Testament. The Greek-speaking community has the authority to decide what belongs in the New Testament. And they have preserved these 27 books for us. And in Acts 17 and verse 26, which of course was originally preserved for us in Greek. I'm in the 18th chapter. I need to go back one. So Acts 17 and verse 26. First, he's in Thessalonica, then he goes to Athens, and I want to go to the 26th verse there. And he says, "And he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth." By the way, that's important. There is one human race ultimately. Yes, we have our differences, and they're not without consequence genetically, in terms of maybe certain physical factors there. There are different groupings, but ultimately there is one human race. We all came from Adam and Eve, and then we all came from the family that survived the flood. So there, although there are the differences, there's one human race. And I'm going to read it in Acts 17:26. "And he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings." So God has directed events in such a way that people have settled in different areas. And as you may remember in Genesis 11, he confused the languages of the nations in the sense that he gave one family, one language, another family, another language, so that they would spread out over the earth, because this was for their good. If they had remained together, the human civilization would have self-destructed a lot earlier. So he sent them in various directions by giving them different languages. So anyway, we see that God is the master geopolitician. And now if we go back to Esther, I'm in the 3rd chapter, and here is where we see, unfortunately, because we are different, that's a bit of a test for us. Can we handle differences? The late great chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, Jonathan Sacks, used to talk about the dignity of difference. Can we handle differences? Can we handle the fact that we, for example, are different colors, even though it's one human race, but there are, the subgroupings, you could say. Can we handle that? Can we handle the fact that we have differences of opinion? Here in Esther 3, we have persecution of God's people, persecution of those who want to live according to the Bible, who want to live according to the commandments of God. In Esther 3 and verse 12, here we have in effect the origin of anti-Semitism. Esther 3:8. In Esther 3:8, then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. So here we see, they're marching to a different drummer. In every age, the Bible will be in conformity with some of the cultural norms and will be contrary to some of the other cultural norms. And so those people living according to the Bible, in one way or another, are going to go against the grain. And therefore, persecution is a fact of life for those who are commandment keepers. It was a fact of life for the Jews through history. It's a fact of life for commandment-keeping Christians. I want to go to 2 Timothy, the 3rd chapter. And I want verse 12. Second Timothy 3:12. Yes, and all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. So one way or another, hopefully it's not something really severe in your case. It may just be a matter that maybe your girlfriend breaks up with you, or maybe you have to go from one job to another, whatever it may be. Of course, it does come often a lot worse, and it will get a lot worse before the second coming of Christ. So anti-Semitism is, in effect, a permanent part of history, but so is persecution of authentic Christians a part of human history. And in any case, we should be praying for those who are in the overall Christian community who are suffering from persecution. Right now, it's really getting more and more difficult, challenging to be a Christian all around the world. And even in so-called democratic countries, there's pressure being brought to bear against people who are trying to maintain the values of the Bible. So we need to pray for one another. Now we come to the 4th chapter of the Book of Esther, and here Esther sends a message because she's about to risk her life to save her people. And she says, towards the end here, verse 15, okay, Esther 4:15. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan, and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise. So before going to her perhaps death, risking her life to go to the king, even though she's not been summoned, she wants everyone to fast. So obviously this does imply God's involvement, even though God is not directly mentioned here. But she talks about fasting. So I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. She didn't, though. God did intervene and grant her favor in the eyes of her husband and the king. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther commanded him. And so there was a fast before the Esther went to see the king. And even to this day, there's more than one reason for it, but there is a fast of Esther among the Jews that precedes the festive holiday of Purim. And even when you go to the 9th chapter of the book of Esther, you find in verse 31 that even though it's a very festive holiday, it's the most festive really of the Jewish holidays, but as they made the commitment to keep Purim, they say in verse 21, Esther 9, verse 31, to confirm these days of Purim at their appointed time, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had prescribed for them, and as they had decreed for themselves and their descendants concerning matters of their fasting and lamenting. All right, so there was fasting involved, even though now it's a very wild kind of a holiday, but even now it's preceded by a fast. So the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. I want to give one more lesson from the book of Esther. I've mentioned 4 so far. I've mentioned God as giving, inspiring prophecy and fulfilling prophecy. God as directing human events, intervening in human events, which is related to the first one, of course. And then I've talked about the persecution that comes upon God's people. And I'm talking now about the relevance of fasting. In other words, one aspect of Christian living is fasting on occasion. Now, you don't get hysterical about it. You don't cause yourself bodily harm. But it is in a balanced way. A part of Christian living is fasting. Of course, there is a compulsory fast in Leviticus 23, if your health will permit. Obviously, if your health will permit, there's the Day of Atonement, which is a fast, which you find commanded in Leviticus 23, and it's also mentioned in Acts 27. But I want to go to Matthew 9, Matthew the 9th chapter. You can find this elsewhere, but I want to turn to Matthew 9, and I want to go to the 14th verse of Matthew 9. And maybe I'll find this one faster than I found the reference in Acts 17. Here we go, Matthew 9:14. Then the disciples of John came to him, saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast?" Here is Jesus' answer. And Jesus said to them, "Can the friends of the bridegroom mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast." So he says, when I'm not here anymore, when I've ascended to my Father, and now I'm interacting in a spiritual way with people, but I'm not present as I am now, they're going to fast. They're going to be looking forward to when I return. In the meantime, they're going to be fasting. So fasting is a part of Christian living. As I said, we want to be balanced about it. But once, there is a commanded fast in Leviticus 23. So that's another point that I wanted to bring out. And I do want to bring out a 5th point, and that's really, you can find that in the 7th chapter. And the fact that Haman had built gallows on which to hang Mordecai, and he was gathering the enemies of the Jews together to exterminate them, mass genocide back then. Wow. But it all turned around, and the enemies of the Jews were killed. But it begins with this decree on Haman. So let's go to verse 9 of Esther 7. Now Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, "Look, the gallows, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing in the house of Haman." So one thing that God worked out was that Mordecai had saved the king's life. That became a factor as well. So I'll quote Harbona again. "Look, the gallows, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman." Then the king said, "Hang him on it! Hang him on it!" And later on, by the way, the 10 sons of Haman were hanged, if you keep reading. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided. So you see, here is the beginning of the victory. So the point that I'm making, the point the book of Esther makes, is that if you're on God's side, you're on the winning side. Whatever challenges occur in history, to God's people, whatever persecutions come upon the church, ultimately the church are the winners. And the church ultimately will be in charge under Jesus Christ of the world. I want to go to Romans, the 8th chapter. And here Paul talks about the problems endured by Christians, and goes back to, I believe, the 44th Psalm. But I want to go to Romans 8:38, how that section concludes verse 37. I'll read verse 38 as a part of it as well. Yet in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. And we understand that he's coming back to rule, and his disciples, his true disciples, will have the opportunity as spirit beings to rule under him. I want to go now to, as I often conclude my talks in the book of Revelation, I want to go to Revelation 3 and verse 21. And this is given to the church shortly before the coming of Christ, because he says in verse 20, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." So this chronologically, prophetically, this is near the end. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and dine with him, and he with me. To him who overcomes, Revelation 3:21, I will grant to sit with me on my throne, as I also overcame and sat down with my Father on his throne. And of course it says, to he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. So let's hear what Jesus Christ says to us as we come near to the time of his second coming. That to him who overcomes, he will have the opportunity to be a ruler under Jesus Christ in this future world that's going to be such a wonderful world. And as we understand from other verses, ultimately those who are a part of God's family now will be fully adult members of his family, that is to say, spirit beings in his family, his sons and his daughters. So this is yet another lesson, a fifth lesson. As I said, we had in prophecy, we had God as the master geopolitician, we had persecution that comes upon God's people, we have the fact of fasting as a part of Christian living, and a fifth lesson is the ultimate victory of God's people. So these are 5 lessons from the 5th festival scroll. All the best to you and yours.